Welcome back. Before the break, I was just talking about the third item of the three poisons, which was ignorance, and how ignorance is not a result of not understanding the law of causes and conditions. I have another story to demonstrate this example. Once there was a man who was very hungry, therefore he bought 7 pancakes. He was so hungry that he ate one after the other. He ate the first one, the second, third, all to the 6th, and half of the last one. Then suddenly he was struck by an idea. He said to himself, I'm satiated with this half a pancake, so all the 6 I have eaten before was all a waste of food. So if only I'd known that I could satisfy myself with this half a pancake, I should have just eaten it first. So, in fact, can the final half of the pancake really satisfy the man's hunger? If he never ate the first 6 pancakes, how could he be full with the last half? Therefore, this is an example of not understanding causes and conditions, and as a result, it will cause him a lot of trouble by not knowing the truth of this life. So therefore, after talking about the 3 poisons, how can we cure these 3 poisons? How do we deal with greed, anger, and ignorance? Let me give you some ideas. In order to help release us from greed, we need to practice generosity. We need to be more generous with the things we have. And secondly, in order to deal with anger, we need to practice patience under insult. Maybe we should take a little more time before we burst out with anger. We take a little more time to calm down before we lose control of ourselves with our anger. And thirdly, in order to deal with ignorance, the Buddha has provided us with the best cure, which is wisdom, or wisdom of the Dharma that he has presented to us. Therefore, by practicing generosity, patience under insult, and wisdom will help us deal with the 3 poisons. The third noble truth is the end or cessation of suffering. As we've talked about the 3 poisons, in order to reinstate or to rediscover our Buddha nature, we need to get rid of the 3 poisons. And the 3 suggestions I have just given you before were just some basic ideas. So let me talk a little bit more about how we get rid of suffering. There is suffering because we have desires. So once these desires cease to exist, suffering will cease to exist too. But this doesn't mean that from now on you stop wanting anything around you. This doesn't mean that you should give up your family, everything you have now. Rather, it's about pulling yourself out of that abyss of desire and stop thinking about the things you want. So instead of trying to get what you want all the time, we should start, instead of wanting things for your own benefit, maybe we should start looking at the things that you can offer to the world. So as a finger that points to the moon, the third noble truth is the finger that points to nirvana. So it tells us something about nirvana, but at the same time, the third noble truth itself is not actually nirvana. If we want to live in a world of freedom and content, we need to try to make sure that our suffering or desire cease to exist. So therefore, cessation of suffering will become nirvana. But what is nirvana? Nirvana is a state that cannot be described by language. It is beyond the 3 poisons. So it is beyond greed, anger, ignorance, and of course suffering. It is also beyond all duality. It is beyond all distinctions between right and wrong, self and others, good and bad, and life and death. There are 4 ways to help us understand nirvana. The first one is what is called original nirvana, or this means the original or fundamental nature of everything. So this is the inherent Buddha nature that lies within all of us. Secondly is what is called nirvana with remainder. So this means an enlightened person who still has a body. And this body is there because his past karma still exists. And although he stops making and creating more karma because he's an enlightened person, he still needs to bear the consequences of the karma that he had created before he attained nirvana. So therefore, he still has a body. And thirdly is the nirvana called nirvana without remainder. This is an enlightened person who no longer has a body, so he's beyond the status of physical form or matter. The last is called nirvana without abiding. This is an enlightened being who could enter nirvana, but chooses to stay in this world to help other people and reach the same status, which is nirvana too. Some of the examples are the bodhisattvas. Although they have reached the status of nirvana and have also attained enlightenment, because they see that there are a lot of beings who are still suffering in this world. Therefore, they have shown so much compassion that they decided to stay in this world and help the sentient beings in reaching the same goal. I've talked about how nirvana cannot be described by language, but here, of course, we will try our best to help you understand what nirvana is like. So I would like to list the following 10 metaphors of nirvana, which can describe what it is like to be in nirvana. But bear in mind, these are just the basic ideas. Who knows? For those who have really entered nirvana, it could be a status much greater than these. But of course, it would be good enough for us to start with these 10 metaphors here. The first one is that nirvana is like a lotus flower. We know that a lotus plant grows in mud, and it cannot produce a flower if it is taken from the mud. But once the flower grows out of the mud, you can see that none of the mud sticks to the flower, so the lotus remains so pure and clean. Therefore, nirvana is the same. Even for those who have attained nirvana in this circular world, although this world is still full of greed or what we call poison, it itself remains pure and unaffected. Therefore, it is like a lotus flower. Secondly, nirvana is just like water. We know that water cleans everything away, so it can clean anything that is dirty. So nirvana here is like water that clears away all the suffering. So just as water can put out the fire, so nirvana can put out the heat of our defilements. And also, water can slake the most terrible thirst, or it quenches our thirst. Therefore, nirvana can relieve even the worst suffering. Thirdly, nirvana is like an antidote for all poisons, so that there are a lot of poisons of delusion, and here nirvana can cure all of these delusions. Fourthly is that nirvana is like a great sea. So a truly great sea has no shores anywhere. It is limitless and without preference. So it can take in anything that goes into this ocean. The same goes to nirvana. And fifthly, nirvana is like food. So good food can help satisfy our hunger, and it can give our body strength. So the same thing goes to nirvana. It can satisfy all of our desires desires for truth, and answer all of our questions. Sixthly is that nirvana, it can be as vast as a space. So it's like a space that is everywhere. So from what you see, it's everywhere. It's all around the things that we see. It's in front of me. It's also next to me. It's everywhere. So just like space, nirvana doesn't depend on anything. And still, everything depends on nirvana, just how we live around space. So we depend on space. And seventhly, nirvana is like a mani jewel. So a mani jewel is so magnificent that it could inspire anybody who looks at it. So the same goes to nirvana. Even the deluded mind, when it comes into contact with nirvana, can feel a lot of inspiration. And eighthly, nirvana is like sandalwood. Just like sandalwood is rare, nirvana is also rare. And sandalwood is very fragrant. It's much more fragrant than any other wood. So the excellence of nirvana exceeds all of the other things. Ninth is that nirvana is like the wind. So due to its unsurpassable magnificence, nirvana has a kind of attractive power that silently draws sentient beings towards it. So the same thing that goes to nirvana, it has a power that pushes all sentient beings towards it. Therefore, it's like a wind. It's like wind that can take us across the sea. And the last one is nirvana is like a mountain peak, so that is on top of everything. So let us take another short break now and stay with us. Welcome back. Before the break, I was just talking about the final of the 10 metaphors of nirvana, so let me quickly finish it here. I said that nirvana is like a mountain peak because nirvana is remote and above and beyond all other things, so it could be just as magnificent and great as a mountain peak. So the fact that it's above everything, it is also a place where no seeds of defilement will grow. Therefore, this is how magnificent the nirvana can be. Therefore, it is like a mountain peak. That was the 10 metaphors of nirvana. So now, after getting a basic understanding of what nirvana can be like, let us go on to the fourth noble truth, which is the path to the end or cessation of suffering. This path is a way that leads us to nirvana. So it is a passage between this shore and the far shore. This shore is us, where us, the sentient beings, are. The beings, this shore could now include the Saha world, or the world we live in, which is still full of delusion and suffering. So in order to transcend this world of suffering and delusion, we need to go across to the other shore. So which the other shore is nirvana. So in between, we need to rely on the fourth noble truth, which is the path to the end or cessation of suffering, in order to carry us there, and in other words, free ourselves from suffering. So the fourth noble truth is a way that shows us how to overcome the causes of suffering. And the most basic way to overcome suffering is by following the Noble Eightfold Path. We have already discussed the contents of the Noble Eightfold Path in our previous sessions, so I will just quickly go through the contents here. So by overcoming the causes of suffering, we need to practice the following. We need to practice right view, right thought, right speech, right action, right work, right progress, and right mind. Then finally it comes to right concentration. That was the path to the end or cessation of suffering. The Four Noble Truths were amongst the first teachings given by the Buddha, and it was also amongst the last teachings spoken by the Buddha himself. Therefore, this should emphasize the importance of the Four Noble Truths, especially throughout the 49 years of Buddhist teachings. Upon the Buddha's deathbed, or what we say before the Buddha entered nirvana, he said to his disciples, speak up and have questions about doubts or the validity of the Four Noble Truths before it is too late. So from this, we can really see how the close attention that the Buddha had paid to the Four Noble Truths throughout his 49 years of teaching. And the Buddhist years of teaching was divided into the 3 periods to help us understand the fullness of his message. And these are called the 3 turnings of the wheel. In Chinese, we call this 三转法轮. So the first turning of the Dharma wheel, also known as the explanatory turning of the wheel, is when the Buddha explained the basic truths upon which his enlightenment was based. So this was the first turning of the Dharma wheel. While the second turning of the Dharma wheel, which is also known as the persuasive turning of the Dharma wheel, it was named this because this was a period when the Buddha persuaded his disciples to end their suffering by fully understanding what the Four Noble Truths tried to tell them. So that was the second turning of the Dharma wheel. As for the third turning of the Dharma wheel, it was also known as the self-proved turning of the wheel. So this was a period when the Buddha used himself as an example of someone who has attained enlightenment. Therefore, in the hope of having done so, he hoped that his disciples could do the same. So this is like, if I can do it, so can you. We can all do it. Therefore, these 3 periods make up the 3 turnings of the Dharma wheel. Basically, the Buddha is the doctor who cures our desires and attachments to delusion. And in order to help us do this, it was like our delusion and desires are the illnesses that require the right medicine. So what kind of medicine did the Buddha give us in order to cure this illness? Well, the Buddha, as the doctor, gave us the Four Noble Truths as a medicine to help us cure our illness of desire and attachment. So all we need to do is just take this medicine. So we take it, we accept the Four Noble Truths and practice it, and with the belief that it will help us cure our illnesses of defilement and attached desire. So the best way to end suffering is by understanding the Four Noble Truths. What do we need to understand? We need to start by understanding what suffering is. And after that, we need to understand how suffering comes about, or how suffering is caused, or what actually causes suffering. So we think about how we are trapped in this world full of suffering and why we're here. And thirdly, we start to think about what it is like when we are free from suffering. So we try to, in a way, try to imagine how it will feel like when we free ourselves from the traps of desire and attachment, and of course suffering. And that wonderful feeling we get by being free from all of these could be nirvana. And lastly, after thinking about what suffering is, then think and what causes it and what it's like to be beyond suffering, we start to think about how we can end this suffering. So back again, that was to how we take this medicine that was given to us by the Buddha as the doctor. So once we take this medicine, our illness can be cured. Therefore, if I want to put simply what I have just talked about, or to sum it up, the Four Noble Truths can be compared to the procedure of curing an illness or disease. From the start, we become sick, so we feel all the suffering or the uncomfort that goes through our body. This becomes the cause of suffering. After realizing what caused the suffering, we try to give ourselves the right medicine. So we provide all kinds of treatments for this illness. For example, do more exercise, eating the right food, or taking an injection, or maybe even an operation, depending on what is required. This is called the path to the cessation of suffering. Although it is important for us to cure our physical illness, it is also important to pay more attention to our mental illness, and this will depend heavily on the cures that are provided by the Buddha. So basically, by looking at the concept of curing an illness, we can see that the Four Noble Truths corresponds very much to the spirits of science and medicine. And this also shows how applicable Buddhism can be to life. So the Four Noble Truths is the fundament of all Buddhism. So this was what was realized by the Buddha when he attained enlightenment. And while what the Buddha had awakened to was the idea of dependent origination, it was way too difficult for our sentient beings to understand. So in order to prevent sentient beings or us from being fearful of what we have to come across if we want to learn Buddhism, the Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths to us in order to help us understand why there is the cycle of rebirth and how we can find a path to liberation. So, and furthermore, to help us or to inspire us to step onto this path to Buddhahood. And of course, the main reason that he taught us the Four Noble Truths was for us to realize that there is suffering, and to put an end to the cause of suffering, and to travel on the path to the end of suffering, and then attain enlightenment or nirvana. Therefore, that was the ultimate truth that the Buddha had tried to teach us. So let me revise the Four Noble Truths with you again. The Four Noble Truths in Chinese is 四圣谛. And the first truth is suffering, which is 苦. Then the cause of suffering, 集. Then the end of suffering or the cessation of suffering, which is 灭. And then the path to the end of suffering, which becomes 道. That was the most fundamental teachings in Buddhism we have just explored today. That was the Four Noble Truths. And we will stop here, and hopefully we will see you next time so that we can dwell further on the other basic concepts of Buddhism. Thank you very much for joining us. See you next time.